Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Day Everyday podcast, where we aim to spotlight exemplary activists, policymakers, and changemakers in the field of sustainability and climate change. I'm your host, Aryan Doshi, and today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Helen. Helen is a renowned British marine biologist, broadcaster, and author of the book What the Wild Sea Can Be. Helen, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for taking the time. And I know we have, so much to discuss today, but maybe before we sort of jump right in, can you just tell our audience a little bit more about yourself, and your story? When did this interest in marine biology and start, and what sort of brought you to the field and got you to think that, this is something I want to do for the rest of my life?
Sure, of course. So I'm from the UK. So I grew up here in England. I mean, we live on an island, but even so, there are places that aren't that close to the ocean, and that's where I grew up. It was a good few hours from the sea, so you might think that's a little strange. But I did spend a lot of vacation time, holiday time with family, mostly down in the southwest, down in Cornwall, which is the bit of England that sticks out into the Atlantic.
Wow.
So for me, I guess that's where it started. When I was a kid, I used to love going to beaches. I was always the one playing in the sea, looking to see what I could find in rock
Wow.
pools. All of it just fascinated me, and I loved being by the ocean and in the ocean. And then when I was a teenager, I had the opportunity, again slightly strangely, because I didn't live anywhere near the sea, but I had the chance to learn to scuba dive.
Wow.
There was a local dive group, and they trained once a week in a swimming pool. And a friend and I decided we would go and do that. And once I had my first dive in the open ocean, I knew instantly this is what I wanted to do. I was hooked from the minute I saw my first fish. I just loved the sensation of being in the ocean, being in their world. I felt like suddenly the aquarium tank wall had fallen away and
Wow.
I was in their world, and all I
Yeah.
wanted to do was follow after that fish, and find out about its life, and just spend as much time as I could underwater. So I guess that was it. And then after that, I just did as much as I could to do that, to be in the
Yeah.
ocean, to be by the ocean. And it's never gone away. I've always had this. It's hard to explain, but just something in me that
Yeah.
I feel it when I'm there, and when I'm looking in the ocean and being in the ocean. I just love it.
Yeah, and like you talk about it, like there's sort of this innate connection that you feel, right, when you're in the ocean, when you're with all those aquatic species, right? And that's sort of this wonderful sort of emotion to feel. And I know you also mentioned that you are scuba diving, and I was wondering, I know it's sort of hard to see, but over these last few years or maybe decades, as you scuba dive, have you seen sort of any difference or change in what you're seeing underwater?
I have, and that is, it's sad to say that I have seen changes, and I've been in the ocean when big changes have happened. So, for instance, I was diving in the Caribbean in Belize, in the late 1990s, when one of the first times there was a big coral bleaching event. So that's
Oh
just
my
when there's a heat wave and the corals get too hot, they lose the colorful algae from their tissues and they bleach white, and sometimes that leads to them dying. I mean, often that does happen, but this was quite a new phenomenon. It wasn't happening so much back then, so we didn't really know
Yeah,
what this was, and
yeah,
we were kind of surprised by it. So I saw that. I mean, I've seen plastic pollution so badly in some places. I really do know what it feels like to swim in a plastic soup with just bits
yeah,
of plastic around you. I've been in the ocean in Malaysia when a fish bomb went off not too far away, and that was terrifying. So it's a type of fishing. It's actually
wow,
it is illegal in many countries,
yeah,
but it's a technique of basically putting explosives in the water. It puts off a great big pressure wave in when it explodes,
yeah,
kills fish from a huge distance around, and then you can just scoop them up.
yeah,
And I was in the water. It felt like the bomb had gone off right next to me. But when I came up, the fishing boat was miles away. But it just sounded so loud. It was terrifying.
yeah,
So that was kind of a bit of a sharp experience of just what it feels like to be
yeah.
in the ocean when these big changes are happening. So yeah, so sadly I have. I've seen species being overfished. I've seen places where there should be animals where there aren't. But I've also seen some really beautiful places. I've been very lucky to see where the ocean is very healthy, and see that there is a great chance for it to recover and restore as well. So I guess I've seen both sides of things,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
Mm.
And I know you talk about that side of seeing the coral breaching, like seeing those sort of those fish bombs, right? But what do you sort of tell people who maybe haven't had that experience, right? Because a lot of the times you have to feel it to believe it. And when someone hasn't been in that sort of environment that you've been to, how do you convey that story and convey that message that, this really is a pressing issue and a pressing problem that we as humanity have to fix?
Yeah, and it's I think it's something I like how to communicate these questions of getting other people to think about it. And in the past I've had to kind of deal with the question of like, should I talk about the wonder of the ocean or the problems?
For
And
sure.
because people will respond differently to either. I could tell you how beautiful and wonderful it is, but I could tell you about all the troubles. Which is more effective? And I've come to realize actually we need to do both, and in different ways, because people will respond in different ways to stories, right? You can read a book, or you can watch a YouTube video, or you can, send a message to someone else and just say, hey, have you heard about this or that? So I think it all matters. All of these different ways of communicating, and I think it is about getting a balance. I think it's like in the first case, yeah, we need to share our wonder and our love of these incredible places. And I think
For
that's a
sure.
good starting place,
Yeah,
right? Like this is why we care, because it is beautiful and amazing and
absolutely.
weird. And just there's so much to learn about. And then at the same time, there comes that point where, we really can't ignore the problems too. So that's why I'm increasingly talking about the problems in the ocean, because people know about it. You see plastic waste, right? You go to the
Yeah,
beach and you see that, or you've heard about overfishing maybe. And I think more people want to understand better those issues, because I think there is a growing awareness of, just the problems our planet faces. And I
absolutely.
do think we need to talk about it, because I think that's empowering, because we can understand the problems as well as the solutions. So I find myself doing both these days.
Yeah,
And maybe depending on the audience and the time and maybe how I'm feeling that day, I might, lean one way
yeah,
more or the
one side
other.
of
But
that.
ultimately, I think we do need to also within ourselves realize we can be both kind of hopeful for the future, but
For
also
sure.
aware of and kind of aware of the issues and the
Yeah.
problems at the same time. Yeah.
And on that note of how you sort of spread this message to really people from all facets of society, can you maybe talk a little bit about, your book, What the Wild Sea Can Be, and what was the inspiration for that? Was it also trying to combine both this positive side and negative side as well and merge that into one?
Yeah, it kind of was actually. I mean, I think I partly decided to write it to see if to help myself understand, like, am I an optimist or a pessimist? Because people would ask me that. In
Yeah,
fact, that kind of was the spark for the book, was realizing that oftentimes I would get asked by people, oh, it's gonna be like, is it like either they'd say, is it gonna be okay? Like you've told me about all these problems, like surely we're
yeah,
gonna fix that. Or they would say, are you hopeful? And I was kind of finding it hard to answer that. So I thought, well, I could spend time thinking about it and write a book. It's like I'm an author, that's what I do. Like if I have
yeah,
something that's bothering me, I'll write a book about it.
yeah,
And so because I can spend the time and think about something, talk to people, and do the research. So yeah, it was really just that kind of personal quest, as well as wanting to help other people make sense of how the ocean is changing. Because obviously I felt that was just a question that a lot of people are wondering about, like what does the future hold?
true.
Can we be hopeful? Like almost they wanted permission to say,
Yeah,
let me
I
be
can see
hopeful.
that. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's where it came from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times, though, when people sort of hear that message, I know we were talking about this earlier as well. It's like, how am I as one person going to make any impact, especially as we're living in a world, with billions and billions of people, right? It sort of seems that it would be very minimalistic, and with that sort of thought in mind, why should I help at all, right? And so, what sort of message do you tell people who, aren't sure where to begin, and how can they start by minimizing their disruption on aquatic species? Like, what is sort of your ground zero level to just start helping?
Yeah, I mean, I get it, and I have that feeling too. Like I'm one person, the troubles are huge, whether we're talking about the climate crisis, or pollution, or overfishing, all these things. Um, but I think, I mean, a good starting place. Well, there's two things really. One is just to realize you can't save, like I can't save the ocean. You can't
Yeah,
save the ocean, not on your
absolutely.
own. None
Yeah,
of us can. But the point is, we're not on our own. And what I really kind of appreciate the shift that's happened in my lifetime. So when I was at high school, it was kind of unusual to spend time thinking about and talking about nature and the environment. I
sure.
mean, people did, but it just wasn't as big a deal.
Yeah.
And I did feel like I was a bit of an odd one out. Like I was the one. I was, people could point like in. out of the whole school, like she's the one who cares.
Yeah.
Whereas I think it's really different now. I think a lot of people, more people, there's a lot more awareness, a lot more people do care and do want to make a difference. And that in itself is super important. Like we have so many more voices and so many, we're all, and we can all know we're out there now because of
Yeah.
social media, because of the way we can connect across oceans, right? So that in itself is super powerful. So you're not going to do it on your own, but we're all going to do it together, and we're going to do it in our own ways. And I think a powerful thing to hold in your mind is, what are you good at? Like what do you enjoy? Like
Absolutely.
not all of us can do it all, right? So you need to pick something, right? I love stories and I love writing and I love talking, so I do that. That's what I do. But there's so many other things to do.
For sure.
And they can be super simple things too, like just knowing and caring and finding things out and talking to people and talking to your family
Right.
and your friends is so powerful, because
Yeah.
you're basically spreading this whole message about nature and the ocean and the environment to them as well. So you're like this little multiplier, right?
Yeah.
If you're an artist, that's super powerful. If you're a musician, if you play sport,
Yeah.
whatever it is, there are now ways to connect that through to doing better for the environment and
Absolutely.
showing the way to other people. And I think at the same time, just realizing, yeah, you are one person, but you have influence, and it isn't up to you, but you can be part of this, and that
Yeah.
is really powerful.
Yeah.
So there isn't a right or wrong way to go about it. Just it's more of a mindset of find your thing that you're good at, and if you don't know what that is yet, just go try things.
Yeah.
See what you might like to do and to amplify this message and make a difference. Um, and don't feel guilty when you can't do everything at once, because that can also be really tough. Like you feel like, oh, I failed.
Yeah.
I bought a drink in a plastic bottle. It's like, yeah, okay, but you can do better, and celebrate the things you do better, and don't feel guilty about the things that you
Yeah.
can't.
For sure.
Yeah,
And I think the way you put it, right? I think that's also one of the beauties of environmental science is that it's interdisciplinary, right? Whatever sort of field, major you might be working on, you could be a mathematician, but you're developing models that help to better show the trajectory, of our environment for future generations, right? You could be a musician, you could be a guitarist, and you're creating this music that conveys this emotion, right? So I
yeah,
think whatever you're working on, whatever your hobbies are, I think in today's day and age, like you say, there always is a way to add that element of environmental science. So I think
yeah,
that is a really powerful message. And maybe just to sort of shift topics a little bit and talk about something maybe sort of interesting is the way we sort of see, our climate changing, right? Some areas experiencing more drastic heat waves, others more short cold bursts, right? Have you sort of seen any species that has even by the slightest amount experienced this positive impact due to the climate rise? I know it's a bit of an odd question to ask because a lot of the times there's this sense of negativity, but are there perhaps species that have managed to benefit, maybe even in the aquatic sense?
yeah. I mean, it's an important thing to look at, I think, and to understand that, and to appreciate that this is not just a kind of a good or bad thing,
Yeah.
right? It's not just everything is going to suffer the same amount. And that's actually an idea I try to unpack a bit in the book, which is like the idea that there are winners and losers, in terms of species and in terms of humans as well, really around the planet. We're all experiencing these changes in different ways,
Yeah.
and even the losers, we're not going to give up on those, but they are the ones who are,
100%.
are responding in a negative way, and it's not doing those species much good. But there is a great deal of adaptation of, in the ocean particularly. I mean, species, for instance, are moving really quickly,
Wow.
as the ocean warms up, and we're seeing greater migrations in the ocean than on land for various reasons. One reason why things can move, there's a lot of very mobile things in the ocean.
Yeah.
So we are seeing this change of where species are, and some are doing well. I mean, we're seeing things like all this sort of, in the Atlantic, for instance, there's a whole group of animals that feed kind of in the temperate parts.
Wow.
Maybe a couple of
Yeah.
decades ago, temperate parts of the Atlantic, there are whale species like fin whales and what are the other ones? I think there's possibly minke whales, and species that aren't really ice associated, but are now
Yeah,
moving further north because the ice is retreating in the Arctic. So yeah, if you want to look at it like that, those populations are spreading, and they are, increasing in numbers and moving into new areas that are becoming available to them. So I guess, and there's lots of other examples of species whose ranges are expanding. Some of them with extra human help too. One example I write about in the book is the lionfish, which are native to the Indian Ocean, Indian and
yeah.
Pacific Ocean coral reefs, but have been moved into the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean
Wow.
because of human activities. The Mediterranean ones have come through the Suez Canal, and the Atlantic ones were released from aquariums.
Sure.
So they're in new areas now where they didn't exist naturally. And they're expanding too because of the warming climate. As the
Sure.
oceans get warmer, they're expanding their
Yeah.
range. Environmentalists at first and still are quite concerned about the impacts this species is having. There's two species, but they look very similar. These beautiful, they are very beautiful fish. Like there's no
Yeah.
question, even though they're these invaders, if you like that word.
Mhm.
They're red with stripes and these beautiful long spines, which are
Wow.
poisonous, so you need to stick clear
Yeah.
of them. And people were worried about the impact they'd have on ecosystems, and that is there, but it's also a question of how, if an ecosystem is in a fairly healthy state, and is protected from overfishing, they tend to not be so badly impacted by the arrival of lionfish.
Yeah.
So again, it's not just lionfish equals bad. It's like, if we look after the ocean in other ways and these ecosystems, they aren't, they can fit in a bit more without having those problems of basically eating all the other fish
Sure.
and causing
Yeah.
trouble. So I think it's important to think about this in a kind of more nuanced way. Like we said, like some things are winning, some things are losing, some things are
Yeah.
adapting. And that's the kind of the difficulty of predicting the future in the ocean, is that it's all quite messy.
Yeah.
But that's part of the reality, is that we're not just going to see a wholesale loss of this and that. It's going to be
Just
mixing and
around.
changing in
Yeah.
different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like you say, right, it is a multifaceted issue, and you talk about positive human intervention. I think maybe one of the best ways that we as humans can contribute to helping these aquatic species is through policy. And I don't know, have you sort of seen any beneficial policy, whether it be from where you live, from where I live? We recently saw the Chevron doctrine, overturned in the United States, which was sort of a loss because the EPA had done so much, good work. And I think a lot of the change that we wish to see in society sort of falls back to policy and creating these sort of incentives for both corporations and citizens to sort of execute on.
Yeah.
And so, how do you sort of see policy shaping the way we navigate our ocean and the well-being of these aquatic species?
Such a great question, and so important. It is so key to how we are going to be looking to change the problems, is
Yeah,
to try and figure out how that translates into what's actually happening on the ground. And I think there's a couple of things to think about. One in particular is that a lot of these issues, these ocean issues, are really global in extent. If we're talking about the issues of plastic pollution, obviously the climate crisis,
sure.
overfishing, a lot of these are problems that are not just operating locally, but we've got to look at it at a really larger scale, simply because things like, migrations of ocean species crossing boundaries, um, there needs to be an international cooperation on this. A lot of things are happening out in the high seas, which don't belong to any particular country, and so we need to figure out how is the international community going to get together to look after these
For
places, because
sure.
there's increasing exploitation. So I think a really important aspect of this is how our country's going to cooperate and come up with rules and
Yeah.
policies that are going to work on this large scale. And we are seeing moves in this direction. It's really difficult. This kind of negotiation is long and slow, and it's not easy, but
Yeah.
it is possible. And we are seeing, I do genuinely think we're seeing progress. For instance, in the high seas, there is now a treaty that's been drafted out, which would look at finding better ways of managing and protecting these areas beyond national
Wow.
boundaries. We're
Yeah.
waiting now to see more countries ratify that, and then will become, it'll become a binding treaty. But that, was seen as being impossible maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So we're seeing progress in terms of this kind of international negotiation. Equally, there's a push towards plastic pollution and a global plastic treaty, and I really hope we get to see that too. There are kind of more regional policies as well that are doing important things. For instance, often a lot of the fisheries are looked at basin by basin. So you've got
Wow.
like, a group that will be looking at the Atlantic,
Yeah,
maybe the North and the South, and then the Indian Ocean for particular species that grow
for
that are
sure.
there. So tuna are an important one of these highly
Yeah,
migratory species. And they're looked at on a regional basis, and countries that are involved, that are in that region or that are involved in the fisheries, take part in those negotiations. And we
yeah.
do see um, things happening at that scale which make a difference. So an example of that is the bluefin tuna in the Atlantic, a
Wow.
species that was really heading towards extinction
Yeah.
maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and finally the science was kind of getting into those negotiation into those rooms where all those people were sitting down going, how many tuna should we catch and where should we catch them?
Yeah.
And the scientists all the time have been saying catch fewer and they will recover and we'll do better. And finally they began to believe and take those recommendations on board. And what we're seeing now is an increase in that population. Instead of it, nose diving, these beautiful big species, which are very highly valued for the
Yeah.
sushi trade around the world, that were being heavily targeted for that trade, their populations are increasing, and we're seeing them coming back here in the
Wow.
UK. And people forgot they even used to live here.
Yeah.
People are seeing these huge, great, big, fast-moving predators, and are kind of proud of that. Remembering is that remembering of those connections locally, but a lot of that came down to having to negotiate internationally. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of focus. I know you were asking me this on a more of a, I think a more of a local scale, and that's really important too. But I've given you a global answer to that.
Yeah,
But
yeah. No, and I
I
think
do
having
think.
those different scales in mind is important, right? Because a lot of the times it may not necessarily be, international collaboration. It might just have to be, on maybe a regional, on maybe a local city to city basis that you're trying to find and develop change, right? A lot of the times, you in the context of the world, right, your impact is probably going to be small, but you have to be okay with that and maybe just focus a little more locally and once you see the change you want to see locally gradually start to expand. So I think that's always important to have at the back of your mind. And maybe if we can just shift gears a little bit, and if I can just ask you, like throughout all these years, what has been one of the most fulfilling wildlife conservation projects that you've taken on, whether it be working with aquatic species or even if it's on land as well? Like what has been maybe the most emotionally fulfilling piece of work that you've done?
It's a really lovely question and really hard to answer because
Yeah.
I'm now thinking about all the wonderful things that I've been really lucky to see and experience. And so narrowing it down to one is actually, I'm going to wriggle out of it and say
Yeah.
I'm not going to, I can't choose one. Um, but I'd like to just maybe tell you a couple of little stories, which I think would encompass like the kind of range of things that
Yeah.
I've really lucky to experience and the changes I think, and also bringing this down to a kind of a smaller scale. And actually, I think broadly what I'm going to talk about is times when I've encountered and been lucky enough to visit places in the ocean that are being really well looked after, and
Wow.
the consequences of that care is just beauty and wonder that I've been experiencing.
Yeah.
And often that does come down. It can be big or it can be small. Um, I mean, there's a place I've not ever been personally that I wish I could go to, which is the Ross Sea in Antarctica, which is one of the
Wow.
biggest marine protected areas now, and it's an icy wilderness where there are orca and penguins and krill and Patagonian toothfish and incredible species that are just being left alone for the most part. And the fact that that exists at all, I think, is wonderful. So I didn't experience that one, but it's sort of the idea of the ability to protect big parts of the ocean,
Sure.
um, and how important that is for the health of the global ocean. But I have myself personally experienced much smaller little pieces of the ocean that have been protected, but are still so precious and such a big part of how we can fit this together. And one of them is a tiny marine reserve that I visited in Scotland,
Yeah.
called the Lamlash Bay no take zone. So no take zone are the most highly protected. It's one word we use for very highly protected areas of the ocean because you get a range. Sometimes some kinds of fishing are
Sure.
allowed and so on, but
Yeah.
a no take zone, the idea is you take nothing from it. You just leave it be. Whatever is there stays there, apart from the animals can come and go as they please. And I went freediving there, and I just felt this sense. This area is only like a mile. I think it's like a square mile. It's really not big, and it
Yeah.
was put in place by the local community who were driven by basically scuba divers who kind of had this sense that it should be better, that their ocean, their piece of coast,
Yeah.
off this island of Arran, off the west coast of Scotland, used to be better, and they had memories from older divers and fishers who used to see better species, and they decided that they would do something about it, and they campaigned, and they got this small little piece of seabed caught, like, decide, this is now off limits to any fishing, and they've seen incredible recovery of the seabed habitats,
Wow.
beautiful seaweeds and scallops that are huge like tea plates, and
Yeah.
lobsters are growing bigger. The whole habitat is much more healthy, and what it's done is, so I guess what I've done is I've got like big global, big reserves
Yeah.
like the Ross Sea are important, down to this tiny one in Scotland. But what that little one did is it seeded the idea that this can be done, and other people are doing this too, and are demanding a
Yeah.
better health for their ocean and their piece of it. So those are adding up more and more, and it's just showing what's possible by people often just standing up and saying, this should be better, and it could be better. We just need to
Sure.
stop fishing here, or whatever that local issue is. We need to move that sewage pipe. We need to not build that fish farm right here, and the
Absolutely.
results can be amazing. And so going and visiting that place was really special, and just floating there in that, just off the coast. It wasn't a big, drive offshore or anything. It was, I just walked into the water with my scoot, with my snorkel kit on, and saw this piece of the sea, which was just super healthy. And it just made me think, what, this is possible, right? We
Yeah.
can do this anywhere.
Yeah, no, I think
So
that is, yeah, that is such a beautiful story, right? It also goes to show that, a lot of the times your impact doesn't necessarily need to be like off the chart, right? Maybe you just focus on one sort of small area that's, beloved and personal to you, and focus on making that the best possible place it can be, right?
Mhm.
And then I love the way you sort of talk about the Ross Sea as a more global thing, and then bring it back down to, what's local and what we can do on an everyday basis as well. So I think that's phenomenal. And maybe just one sort of last question I like to end off all my podcasts with is, you've done some incredible work, right, in the field of environmental science, right? Writing a book, scuba diving, trying to make sure all of our underwater species are protected. But what sort of advice do you have to someone who's just entering the field and maybe they don't know where to start, right? Like we were talking about earlier, the field of environmental science is so interdisciplinary. And maybe that could also be for worse in the sense that you just don't know where to begin, right? There's so many possible paths and opportunities. And so what advice do you have so that someday they can reach the position and level that you've been able to do?
A great question. And I hope there are lots of people watching this and listening to this who feel maybe there's some spark that they have for something in the world. And
Yeah,
it doesn't actually matter what it is. This could be anything. It doesn't even have to be the environment. I know we're talking about the environment, but if you have
yeah,
if there's something, even if you can't quite just say why, but something that excites you, go after that and see where it leads you. And that's all I've ever done, really. I've honestly just found the things, sometimes by chance, sometimes because I've just gone and tried things and realized I love it, and then sort of see where that, followed that for a bit and see where it takes me. Like, I'm a writer now, and I never expected that when I was younger. It wasn't something I thought about. I mean, I think
yeah,
I was doing it. I was writing journals, and I was interested in stories, but it wasn't something I thought, hey, I can do this. And then that kind of came into my life later on, and I realized actually that's what I want to do. So I went down that way. So if there is a thing, if there's something, whether it's big or small, whatever it is, just go and
hone in
have a
on it.
look and
Yeah,
see. If you're lucky to have a whole bunch of things that you want to do, then
yeah,
do just try them out.
yeah, absolutely.
Because that in itself is something I can't tell you, go away and be interested in this. Like, you've got
Sure.
to decide for yourself what it is that
Yeah,
that you love, and that fires you up and that excites you. So I would say try things out. Don't worry if it doesn't work out. Something else will come along.
yeah,
And don't worry if you change your mind. In fact, you should change your mind. We should all
yeah,
be trying out different things,
sure.
and that's perfectly normal. Having, and I think, having a goal in mind will drive you to that. But if that goal shifts, that's totally fine.
Okay.
Just try things out, and listen to whatever it weird. I don't know what it is. That weird thing inside just
Yeah,
goes, you love this. This is what you.
yeah.
This is what will get you up every day in the morning and make you rush out the door and go do it. So yeah.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for all those words of wisdom, Helen, and thank you so much to all our viewers as well. And we'll see you all on the next episode of Earth Day Every Day. Thank you so much, everyone.